The forest was vast and quiet, a dense stretch of wilderness untouched by roads or trails. I had chosen this spot for its solitude, miles from any marked campsites or signs of other campers. After setting up my tent, I settled into the isolation, savoring the stillness that could only be found this far from civilization. The dense trees formed a natural barrier around the small clearing, and the only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. The air was crisp, and the sky was just beginning to darken as I started a small fire, grateful for the warmth as the evening chill set in. As the night deepened, I became more attuned to every small sound in the forest around me. The crackling of the fire, the shifting of the wind through the trees, each noise seemed amplified in the silence. Yet, there was a peace in it, a sense of escape from the constant hum of city life. Alone, under the vast stretch of stars, I felt at ease, trusting the quiet and the natural rhythm of the forest. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day took over, and I retreated to my tent, reassured by the solitude that had drawn me here in the first place. Little did I know that this tranquility would soon give way to something far more sinister. As I drifted off, lulled by the distant sounds of the night, I was oblivious to the first signs that I was not alone out here. The morning was crisp and still as I stepped out of my tent, stretching my arms and inhaling the fresh air. It felt good to be out here, disconnected from everything and everyone. My morning routine was simple: gather water from the nearby pond, make breakfast, and prepare for a day of exploring the forest trails. I grabbed my canteen and headed to the water's edge, listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots, a satisfying sound in the early morning quiet. As I reached the pond, I stopped, my eyes catching something unusual in the dirt along the bank. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a set of fresh footprints, slightly larger than mine and pointed toward the water. I frowned, staring at the prints, trying to make sense of them. They hadn't been there the day before, I was sure of it. I'd walked this path myself, and these footprints were recent, as if someone else had been here early that morning, or possibly during the night. I glanced around, scanning the trees and the shoreline, half expecting to see someone emerging from the shadows. But there was no one, only the silent stretch of forest and the faint rippling of the pond. A chill crept up my spine, but I shook it off, reminding myself that the forest was public land. Maybe someone else had come by, unaware of my presence. Still, the sight of those footprints lingered in my mind as I filled my canteen and returned to camp, the sense of being watched lingering just beneath the surface. The day passed slowly, the usual peace of the forest somehow marred by the discovery of those prints. I kept my senses sharp, listening for any out-of-place sounds, scanning the trees every now and then. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that it was nothing, just a coincidence, a random hiker or hunter passing through. As night fell, I set about collecting firewood, venturing a little further from camp than usual in search of the dry branches and kindling I would need to last through the cold night. Just as I was about to turn back, something caught my eye, a dark patch against the ground, surrounded by bits of charred wood. I stepped closer, bending down to examine the spot, and realized I was looking at the remnants of a small fire. Ashes scattered around, still slightly fresh, mixed with leaves and dirt. This fire hadn't been burned long ago, maybe last night or early that morning while I'd been asleep in my tent. My stomach tightened as I stared at the evidence. The footprints by the pond, now this. Someone else had camped close by, within the same patch of forest without me knowing. It was hard to shake the feeling that they'd been aware of my presence, deliberately staying out of sight. I scanned the trees again, suddenly feeling exposed, as if unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. The feeling was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself it could still be nothing. Yet as I made my way back to camp, the forest seemed darker, more foreboding, the trees pressing in with an unnatural stillness. That night, sleep was elusive. Every snap of a twig, every distant rustle in the undergrowth seemed amplified in the stillness. I lay in my tent, fully awake, straining to listen for anything unusual. Eventually, fatigue won out, and I drifted off into a light, uneasy sleep, the remnants of that ash-filled campsite still haunting my mind. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, a noise jolted me awake. It was faint but distinct, a soft rustling right outside my tent. I held my breath, ears straining to pick up any further sound. A moment later I heard it again, a gentle scraping, as if something were brushing against the tent fabric. My mind raced, cycling through the possibilities. An animal, the wind, or perhaps something more deliberate. I reached for my flashlight, careful to make as little noise as possible. With one swift motion, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the area with the light. My heart pounded as I swept the beam across the clearing, illuminating the surrounding trees and the empty, silent space beyond. Then I saw it, a piece of wood lying on the ground, just a few feet from the tent. It wasn't large, just a scrap, but it hadn't been there the night before. I crouched down, examining it, wondering if it had somehow been placed there intentionally. But by whom and why? The stillness of the forest pressed in on me, making every shadow feel ominous, every rustle a potential threat. I stood, flashlight in hand, and continued to sweep the light in a wide arc around the camp. Then, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. A figure, partially hidden among the bushes, watching me. The flashlight's beam barely caught its outline before it seemed to dissolve into the shadows, disappearing without a sound. A surge of fear shot through me, cold and undeniable. I was not alone, and whoever had been leaving those signs had finally made themselves known. Standing there, my flashlight still pointed at the spot where the figure had disappeared, I felt a wave of dread unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The forest, usually a place of peace and solitude, now felt hostile, every shadow concealing a potential threat. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The figure had been there, unmistakable, a dark shape among the underbrush, watching me. And just as quickly it had vanished, slipping back into the dense darkness without a trace. I took a step back toward my tent, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was lurking in the woods. But leaving in the dead of night wasn't safe either. I knew the forest trails well, but navigating them in pitch-black darkness could lead to disaster. I had no choice but to wait until dawn, keeping my guard up and remaining vigilant. I backed up slowly, flashlight still scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. But the forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. As I approached the dying embers of my campfire, I picked up a large branch, half charred from the flames, clutching it like a makeshift weapon. It was little comfort, but it was better than nothing. For the rest of the night, I sat close to the fire, its weak glow offering a semblance of safety. Every few minutes, I'd sweep my flashlight around the clearing, half expecting to catch another glimpse of that figure lurking in the shadows. But the forest remained still, each minute stretching painfully as I counted down the hours until dawn. By the time the first light began to filter through the trees, I was exhausted, but the thought of staying another day was unthinkable. I had to leave, and soon. As the sky lightened, I gathered my gear, moving quickly and quietly, every sound feeling like it would betray my presence to whatever or whoever was out there. I packed my supplies with precision, making sure nothing was left behind, every move driven by the desire to get out as fast as possible. The forest felt different in the early dawn, the shadows receding yet somehow deeper, as if hiding secrets just beyond the edge of sight. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, that same prickling awareness that had haunted me since the first morning I'd found those footprints. It was as if something unseen lingered just out of reach, silently observing my every move. As I took down my tent, I glanced over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see the dark figure emerge from the trees. But the forest remained quiet, watching me pack up with an unsettling patience. I worked quickly, trying not to dwell on the growing sense of dread that filled me. I couldn't afford to let fear slow me down. Once everything was packed, I double-checked the area, ensuring I hadn't left anything behind. I wanted no trace of myself left in this place, no sign that I'd ever been there. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me as I made my final preparations, knowing that I had to leave before the forest swallowed me entirely. With my backpack secured, I took one last look around the clearing, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The morning light was pale and weak, casting long shadows across the ground. I knew I couldn't hesitate any longer. I had to leave, and now. I shouldered my pack and took a deep breath, preparing myself for the trek back to civilization. As I started to walk, I felt an overwhelming urge to turn around, to look back at the place where I'd spent the last few nights. Part of me wanted to confirm that there was nothing there, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But a deeper instinct warned me against it, telling me that some things were better left unseen. I resisted the urge, focusing instead on the path ahead, keeping my pace steady as I moved away from the campsite. The forest seemed to close in behind me, each step taking me further from the place that had felt safe just days before. I felt an eerie sense of finality as I left, as if the forest itself was acknowledging my departure. I didn't look back, not once, refusing to give in to the gnawing curiosity that still lingered. Whatever was out there, it had watched me, stalked me, and now I was leaving it behind. The building stood on the edge of the city, its structure sagging with the weight of years forgotten. I'd been drawn to places like these ever since I was a kid. Abandoned warehouses, empty hospitals, and crumbling mansions all had a strange allure. This building was no different, and as I stood before it that afternoon, my heart quickened, though not out of fear. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so, with only the occasional chirp of birds in the distance. The entrance was barely an entrance at all, a broken frame where a door must have once hung. I stepped inside, greeted by the musty scent of decay. Dust lingered in the air, swirling in the faint sunlight that managed to sneak through cracks in the ceiling. Broken glass and fragments of stone crunched under my feet as I made my way down the initial corridor. Peeling paint clung stubbornly to the walls, and remnants of forgotten furniture lay scattered around, half buried beneath layers of dust and dirt. I moved slowly, savoring the silence. Each room held its own mysteries. Faded graffiti on one wall, a rusted metal bed frame in another. I took a few photos on my phone, capturing the strange beauty in the neglect. The deeper I went, the more the outside world seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie calm that felt like it had been waiting for someone to disturb it. And here I was, alone, my footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. With each step, the building seemed to draw me further into its depths. I moved through empty hallways, feeling the atmosphere grow heavier. The walls here were stained with water damage, and mold crept along the edges, creating intricate patterns of decay. I spotted a doorway that led into a small, windowless room, and curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the remnants of an old office setup, metal filing cabinets, a desk missing half its drawers, lay in a sad, rusted heap. As I moved from room to room, the building's silence began to settle on me like a weight. Every creak of wood or rustle of debris in the wind made me pause, half expecting to hear footsteps behind me. But there was nothing, just the relentless quiet of an abandoned space left to rot. Despite the unease that started to creep in, I felt compelled to keep going. There was something captivating about exploring a place that no one else seemed interested in, like uncovering secrets hidden from the rest of the world. Eventually, I found myself at the end of a hallway, facing a stairwell leading down to what must have been a basement or sublevel. I hesitated for a moment, taking in the thick shadows that seemed to pool at the bottom of the stairs. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I took a tentative step down, then another. The air grew colder as I descended, and I became increasingly aware of the absolute silence surrounding me. Just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, a noise stopped me in my tracks, a faint, almost imperceptible sound echoing through the building. It was rhythmic, steady, like footsteps moving slowly across the floor. For a moment I stood frozen, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination or some animal scurrying in the shadows. But the footsteps continued, unbroken, carrying a weight that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. I strained to listen, the sound growing louder as it seemed to move in my direction. The footsteps were deliberate, as if whoever was making them knew exactly where they were going. I took a step back, instinctively glancing over my shoulder, though I knew the stairs behind me led only to the upper floors. As I turned my gaze back toward the hallway, a low murmur reached my ears, a voice so quiet it almost blended with the building's silence. The voice was soft, almost indecipherable, like someone talking to themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a distinct cadence to it, a rhythmic muttering that echoed faintly in the empty space. It wasn't loud enough to catch every word, yet it filled the silence in a way that made it feel oppressive, suffocating. I told myself it could be the wind, or maybe even my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The footsteps grew louder, each step sending a jolt through me as the sound reverberated down the hall. The murmuring voice seemed to grow clearer, though still too low to fully comprehend. It moved with an unsettling regularity, the way someone might if they were pacing or searching for something or someone. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was, they were getting closer. My mind raced as I scanned the hallway, looking for somewhere to hide or escape. The walls pressed in on me, each empty doorway a potential hiding spot, but also a dead end. There was no way I could outrun the approaching steps without making noise, and every part of me screamed that silence was my only protection. I slipped back toward the stairwell, pressing myself into the shadows, hoping that whatever or whoever it was would pass me by. But as the footsteps drew nearer, I realized that hiding wasn't enough. The voice had shifted in tone, growing louder and more agitated, like someone arguing with themselves in barely restrained whispers. I held my breath, feeling trapped between staying and risking discovery, or making a run for it and hoping I could escape unnoticed. The reality of my situation settled in, cold and undeniable. The footsteps and murmuring continued, relentless and growing closer. My mind scrambled for options. I had come in through the main entrance, but retracing my steps would only lead me back through the building, directly into the path of whoever, or whatever, was approaching. I had to find a different way out, fast. I turned and moved as quietly as I could down the hallway, glancing around desperately for an exit. The rooms I passed were either filled with debris or too dark to offer any safe passage. The sound of footsteps grew sharper, a reminder that I had little time to make a decision. I quickened my pace, keeping close to the wall and casting anxious glances over my shoulder. As I neared the far end of the hallway, I spotted something that could be my only escape, a hole in the wall, large enough for me to squeeze through. It looked as though part of the outer structure had crumbled, leaving a small gap that led outside. Relief flooded through me, but I knew I couldn't waste time celebrating. The footsteps were dangerously close, accompanied by that eerie, muttering voice. Without hesitation, I dropped down, bracing myself as I crawled toward the hole. The rough edges scraped against my clothes, but I barely noticed. The only thing on my mind was getting outside, away from the confined corridors and the sinister presence that had turned a harmless exploration into a nightmare. I pushed myself forward, inch by inch, ignoring the cramped space and the rubble digging into my hands. Freedom was just beyond the wall. As I crawled toward the exit, I risked a quick glance back through the dim light of the corridor. And that's when I saw it, a shadow moving near the place I'd been hiding moments before. It was barely more than an outline, a dark figure gliding through the hall, partially obscured by the surrounding debris. Its movement was slow, almost methodical, as if it knew exactly where I had been standing only seconds earlier. I couldn't see its face, only the vague shape of a person, but that was enough. My heartbeat hammered in my chest, urging me to move faster. The figure didn't stop, didn't hesitate, as it passed through the area I had just left behind, the murmuring voice continuing in a soft, rhythmic chant. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone carried a disturbing certainty, as if the figure were performing some kind of ritual or reciting lines meant for no one else's ears. Every instinct told me to keep going, to get outside before it noticed me. I focused on the rough concrete beneath my hands, the cool air creeping in from the hole up ahead. Just a few more inches and I would be free of this place. I pushed forward, every muscle tense, until finally I felt the ground shift beneath me as I emerged from the wall into open space. The sensation of open air was immediate, and I felt an intense rush of relief. I had escaped. I looked around, half expecting to see the figure emerging from the building behind me, but there was only silence. The exterior of the building loomed dark and imposing, a reminder of the narrow escape I had just made. I forced myself to step back, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that ominous structure. My pulse began to steady as I took in the familiar sounds of the outside world, the distant hum of traffic, the chirping of birds in the trees nearby. I could hardly believe I'd come out unharmed. Part of me wanted to wait and see if anyone, or anything, followed, but the memory of that murmuring voice, so haunting in its quiet madness, convinced me otherwise. This was not a place to linger. I took one last look at the building, trying to make sense of what had happened inside, but there were no answers. Just the stark reality of my encounter with the unknown. The road stretched before me, empty and quiet, a perfect path for clearing my mind. This trip was supposed to be an escape, a chance to get away from the usual routines and drive through new places with nothing but the open road and unfamiliar landscapes ahead. I was deep into the rural areas by now, miles away from any highways, and the quiet was absolute. No other cars, just the steady hum of my engine and the endless stretch of road winding through fields and patches of dense trees. It was late afternoon when I noticed a sign, weathered and half obscured by overgrown bushes. I was already on a less traveled road, but this turnoff seemed even more isolated. Without much thought, I made the turn, thinking it might be a shortcut, or at least an interesting detour. As I drove down the narrow, unmarked road, the landscape began to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches reaching overhead, casting dark shadows that seemed to deepen as the road narrowed. Minutes passed, and I began to realize that I hadn't seen another road sign or any indication of where this path was leading. There was no turning back without retracing miles of isolated roadway. Still, I felt a stubborn determination to continue forward, hoping this unfamiliar road would reconnect with the main road soon. But a prickling sense of unease had already taken root, a subtle reminder that this detour was perhaps not as innocent as it seemed. The road twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the unknown, and soon enough, I began to see signs of habitation. But something felt wrong. Every house or building I passed looked old, neglected, as if the area had been left to decay without a second thought. I barely glimpsed movement at the edges of these properties, but I could feel eyes on me, tracking my car's every turn. A few people stood on porches or in doorways, their faces obscured by shadow or distance, but I could sense their attention, each stare cold and unwelcoming. A wave of apprehension washed over me, and I started looking for a place to turn around. It was clear that my presence wasn't welcome here, and the road only seemed to grow narrower as I continued. I found an open space, but just as I prepared to turn around, a truck pulled out of a side road ahead of me, blocking my path. The driver didn't look my way, but his intention was clear. He wasn't letting me pass. I had no choice but to continue forward, the road narrowing further as the trees closed in. With every turn, more locals appeared at the edges of the road, watching in silence as I passed. I felt trapped, hemmed in by their silent hostility, with no clear way out. I kept driving, hoping the road would eventually lead somewhere more familiar. But deep down, I was beginning to realize I might have made a serious mistake by turning down this road. The landscape shifted again, the once sporadic houses and structures growing sparse, as I was forced deeper into the unknown. The road itself became rougher, riddled with potholes and cracks that forced me to slow down. It felt as if I was being funneled into the depths of this isolated area, each twist and turn leading me further from any hope of escape. The locals seemed to melt away, their homes and figures vanishing into the distance as the road narrowed to a single lane barely wide enough for my car. Odd landmarks started to appear along the road, abandoned shacks with boarded-up windows, strange carvings on the trees, symbols I didn't recognize etched into the wood. Every mile brought something new and unsettling, reinforcing the feeling that I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. I glanced at my fuel gauge, anxiety prickling as I realized I didn't have enough to wander too far off course. But turning back seemed impossible. Each time I considered stopping, I felt the invisible weight of unseen eyes, urging me forward. It was clear now that I was being corralled, forced down this path with no choice but to go wherever it led. The silence around me grew oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath my tires and the distant rustle of trees in the wind. Whatever lay at the end of this road, I could only hope it would give me a way out. But with each passing minute, that hope faded, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving, the road abruptly ended. It stopped without warning, leaving me stranded in the middle of a dense forest with no clear path forward. The pavement gave way to uneven dirt and thick undergrowth, and the tall trees loomed over me, casting deep shadows that felt almost unnatural in their darkness. I checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see the truck or other vehicles blocking my retreat, but the road behind me was empty. For a brief, disorienting moment, I wondered if I had imagined the locals, the hostile looks, the blocked exits. But I knew that wasn't the case. I'd felt their eyes on me, seen their silent, unwelcoming faces. And yet now, here at the road's dead end, they had vanished, leaving me alone in the silence of the forest. I sat there, engine idling, feeling trapped in a place that seemed designed to keep people from leaving. With no other option, I turned the car around, deciding to retrace my route in the hope of finding a way out. But as I began to drive back the way I'd come, I felt an unsettling certainty that the locals hadn't left. They were simply waiting, watching, hidden just out of sight. As I drove back down the same road, the silence of the forest grew heavier, pressing in on all sides. The route was eerily familiar, yet each twist and turn seemed somehow different, as if the road itself were shifting, warping to keep me trapped. Every mile felt longer than before, stretching endlessly as I retraced my path. Despite the unnerving quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the same cold, hostile eyes tracking my every move. I slowed down, glancing around, hoping for any sign that the exit was near. But as I rounded a bend, I caught sight of movement in the distance. There they were, the locals, standing silently along the side of the road, their faces partially obscured by shadow. They weren't moving, just watching as I drove past, their expressions unreadable. They weren't blocking the road this time, but their presence was somehow even more unsettling. The realization struck me. They no longer needed to chase me. They had guided me to the edge of the unknown, and now they were content to watch me try to leave. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine as their stares followed me down the road, silent and unyielding, their eyes filled with a strange satisfaction, as if I'd passed some unspoken test. I continued to drive, the locals appearing intermittently along the roadside. Each time I thought I was free of them, another group would materialize around the next bend, standing in clusters or alone, each one watching in silence as I passed. Their expressions remained blank, impassive, as if my escape, or failure to escape, were of no consequence to them. I avoided meeting their eyes, focusing on the road, but I could feel their presence all the same, a constant reminder that I was still within their territory. Every mile felt like a victory, yet the road stretched on interminably, offering no sign of an exit. I kept driving, fueled by the hope that each turn would bring me closer to the main road, back to the familiar landscapes I'd left behind. But the locals' stares clung to me, their silent vigil filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Their lack of pursuit made their presence feel even more menacing. They were no longer trying to keep me from leaving. Instead, they seemed content to observe my retreat, as if satisfied with the outcome. I couldn't understand their motives, couldn't begin to decipher what they wanted, but I knew that something about this experience would haunt me long after I left this place. Finally, the dense trees began to thin, revealing glimpses of the open sky beyond. Relief washed over me, and I pushed the gas pedal, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that isolated area. Yet, even as I neared the edge of the territory, the locals continued to appear along the road, their expressions unchanged, their stares unwavering. They were letting me go, but I sensed it was on their terms, as if they were allowing me to leave now that I had been thoroughly unsettled. As the forest cleared and the road began to widen, I risked one last look in the rearview mirror. A final group of locals stood gathered in the distance, a dark cluster against the pale light of dawn, watching in silence as I drove away. Their faces were shadows now, indistinct, but the intensity of their gaze remained, their figures growing smaller as I put the last stretch of road between us. For the first time since the journey began, I felt something akin to safety, the familiar world reappearing on the horizon. Yet, the memory of those silent, hostile figures stayed with me, the unnerving realization that they had seen into some part of me, judged me, and then released me without explanation. The drive had been long and tiring, and I was relieved when the GPS finally announced my arrival at the hotel. It was quiet here, tucked away from the main roads in an area that seemed purposefully isolated. The building was old, its structure solid yet faded, with large windows that gave it an imposing, almost stoic appearance. I was exhausted, just wanting a bed and a decent night's sleep before another full day of meetings. The calm, secluded atmosphere initially felt like the perfect place to recharge. Inside, the lobby was quiet, the lights dim, casting a warm but subdued glow over polished wooden furniture and faded wallpaper. The receptionist greeted me with a formal smile, her expression polite yet oddly detached, as if her friendliness was rehearsed rather than genuine. I pushed down the flicker of unease that her expression caused, reminding myself that I was just tired and that the place was probably short-staffed, given its location. After a brief check-in process, she handed me the key, a physical key rather than a card, which struck me as unusual in these days of modern hotels. I took the key and made my way to the second floor, where my room was located at the end of a long, quiet hallway. The silence was almost oppressive, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Inside the room, I immediately felt a sense of relief. It was simple but clean, with a large bed, a nightstand, and a window overlooking a dense line of trees. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in and relax. As I moved to set my phone on the nightstand, something caught my eye. A small notebook, tucked partially between the nightstand and the bed. Curious, I picked it up, noticing the frayed edges and hurried handwriting on the first page. I flipped it open, not realizing that this innocent discovery would mark the beginning of a deeply unsettling experience. The notebook felt worn, as though it had been handled frequently by whoever had left it behind. The first page had only a single phrase scrawled hastily across the top: "Be careful." The handwriting was jagged, uneven, as if written in a hurry. I frowned, turning to the next page, where I found a series of entries, each detailing strange experiences within the hotel. The entries were scattered, fragments of thoughts that hinted at a growing paranoia. There were mentions of noises, footsteps, whispers, the creak of floors, always at night and always getting louder. The notes grew more frantic as I flipped through, the writer's tone changing from cautious curiosity to palpable fear. "They're watching," one entry read, followed by, "Can't sleep, something is wrong here." I set the notebook down, trying to dismiss the sense of foreboding it stirred in me. It was likely just the ramblings of someone who'd let their imagination run wild in an old, quiet building. Still, the notes lingered in my mind, small hints of someone else's fear seeping into my thoughts. After a moment's hesitation, I tucked the notebook back into the nightstand, telling myself to ignore it. It was just a strange souvenir left behind by a previous guest. Yet, as I settled in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow connected to their experience, that their warnings were more than mere ramblings. The night settled in slowly, an overwhelming quietness filling the room as I prepared to sleep. I turned off the light, allowing the room to fall into near total darkness, save for the faint glow from the hallway seeping in under the door. I closed my eyes, telling myself to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. The silence was oppressive, making every sound feel amplified in the empty room. Then I heard it, a faint creak just outside my door, as if someone were moving slowly down the hallway. I held my breath, listening closely, but the sound faded, leaving only the silence. A few minutes later, there was another noise, softer this time, like a whisper carried on the faintest of breezes. I sat up, straining to listen, but the noise stopped, replaced once again by an eerie stillness. Rationalizing the sounds as typical noises of an old building, I tried to dismiss them, but the warnings from the notebook echoed in my mind, each line feeding a growing sense of unease. I lay back down, attempting to ignore the strange sounds, but sleep came only in brief, uneasy bursts. The creaks and whispers continued sporadically, each noise drawing me closer to an unsettling realization. I was not alone in the silence. The next morning, I felt groggy, as though I hadn't slept at all. The memory of the noises from the night before lingered, and the notebook's warnings replayed in my mind, each word gaining more weight in the daylight. I decided to push the experience aside, focusing on my day and hoping a busy schedule would help clear my mind. But as I made my way down to the lobby, the strange atmosphere only intensified. The receptionist was there, her face expressionless as she greeted me, the same rehearsed politeness from the night before. Her gaze seemed to linger a little too long, her eyes following me as I passed by, as if observing every detail of my behavior. It was a look that felt deliberate, calculated, and it unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Later, when I returned to the hotel after a long day, I passed two other staff members in the hallway. Their stares held the same unnerving quality, their expressions blank, polite, yet distant. It felt as though I were being watched, evaluated in some strange and silent ritual. I gave a polite nod, but they merely stood there, observing me with an unsettling formality, their faces unreadable. Back in my room, the isolation felt even heavier. The notebook remained in the nightstand, a constant reminder of the previous guest's unease. Each encounter with the staff had only deepened my own sense of discomfort, and I realized with a pang of dread that the night was fast approaching. The second night began much like the first. Quiet, almost oppressively so. I had settled into bed, hoping that sheer exhaustion would override the strange tension that seemed to fill the room. But as the hours wore on, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive, pressing in from all sides. I lay there, fully awake, listening to the faint sounds of the hotel settling around me, each creak and groan somehow louder than the last. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off, the noises started again. At first it was the familiar creak of floorboards, faint but distinct, echoing through the stillness outside my door. I lay still, trying to convince myself that it was just the building's natural sounds, but the footsteps grew louder, moving slowly down the hallway in a deliberate, measured pace. I felt my pulse quicken, each step adding to the growing unease that settled in my chest. Then came the whispers, soft but unmistakable, as if someone were murmuring just outside my door. The words were too faint to make out, but the tone was low and insistent, almost as if they were calling to me. I sat up, every muscle tense, my mind racing through possible explanations, but none of them seemed sufficient. The sounds were too deliberate, too calculated to be mere coincidence. For what felt like hours, I lay there, listening to the whispers and footsteps as they grew louder and more intense. Sleep was impossible. I could only wait, hoping that the noises would eventually fade. But deep down, I knew that something was very wrong, that the notebook's warnings were not mere paranoia. The next morning, my nerves were frayed, my mind clouded with exhaustion and unease. I made my way down to the lobby, determined to ask the staff if they'd seen anyone on my floor the previous night. But as I approached the reception desk, the receptionist looked up, her gaze sharp and assessing, her expression just as unsettlingly formal as before. "Good morning, sir. I trust you slept well?" she asked, her voice smooth, her smile tight and controlled. I hesitated, searching her face for any hint of warmth or understanding, but her eyes held nothing but that same blank detachment. I asked as casually as I could if anyone had been on my floor late last night. She tilted her head slightly, her smile never faltering, and replied that all guests had been accounted for, that the hotel was very secure. Her tone was polite, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of amusement, or maybe even satisfaction, that made my skin crawl. Feeling increasingly isolated, I retreated to my room, determined to leave as soon as possible. But as the day wore on, the feeling of being trapped intensified. Every encounter with the staff felt more oppressive, each polite smile and blank stare adding to my growing dread. They knew something. They were hiding something. The thought gnawed at me, building a sense of panic that I could no longer ignore. By nightfall, I was dreading the hours to come, the thought of enduring another night of strange sounds and whispers filling me with a deep, primal fear. When night fell, I felt a suffocating sense of dread, as if the walls of the hotel were closing in on me. The thought of enduring another night of those unsettling sounds, of lying awake while footsteps and whispers filled the darkness, was unbearable. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. Something was wrong with this place, something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to ensnare anyone who stayed too long. I gathered my belongings in a rush, every creak of the floorboards setting my nerves on edge. I packed my suitcase as quietly as possible, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. As I zipped my bag shut, I glanced around the room one last time, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, watching me with that same blank, detached stare. When I finally stepped out of my room, the hallway was silent, the oppressive quiet magnified by the empty, shadowed corridor. I moved quickly, my footsteps echoing softly as I made my way to the lobby. I could feel the eyes of the hotel staff on me as I passed, each of them turning to watch, their expressions unreadable. It was as if they knew I was leaving, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. I reached the lobby, and there, at the front desk, was the same receptionist. She looked up as I approached, her gaze calm, almost expectant. I gave a polite nod, not stopping to speak, my only thought focused on reaching the exit. The night shift always started in silence, the kind that felt like it stretched for miles in an empty building. My routine was simple, a repetitive cycle of checking the floors and securing the hallways in a structure designed for bustling daytime activity, but reduced to an eerie stillness after hours. The building itself was vast, with floor after floor of empty offices, the darkened windows creating a hollow sense of space. I walked through the first few floors with practiced ease, my flashlight casting a dim glow on familiar surroundings. The stillness had a way of numbing the mind, and I'd grown accustomed to the quiet. Even the creaks of the floorboards and the hum of the HVAC system felt like part of the usual night symphony. These were the sounds of routine, of predictability. As I moved through each corridor, checking locks and ensuring the building was secure, I felt a sense of calm, a calm that only came with familiarity. Tonight, everything seemed normal, the silence settling over the building like a heavy blanket. The emptiness was a kind of comfort. It was just me and the quiet, a vast, dark building with no one to disturb the peace. But as the hours crept toward midnight, something shifted. It began with a flicker of light. I was on the 5th floor, finishing my round, when the hallway lights above me flickered briefly, casting jagged shadows across the walls. I stopped, my hand hovering over my flashlight, waiting for the lights to stabilize. They dimmed for a moment, then returned to their steady glow. I brushed it off as a wiring issue. An old building like this was bound to have its quirks. But something about it felt different tonight. As I continued, a faint sound reached my ears, a soft, almost indiscernible echo bouncing off the walls. I couldn't place the source, but it sounded like footsteps, or perhaps a door gently creaking somewhere in the distance. I paused, listening intently, but the noise faded, swallowed by the heavy silence of the building. My pulse quickened, but I pushed down the unease, reasoning that it was just the usual sounds of an empty structure settling. I resumed my rounds, the flickering lights and faint noises lingering at the back of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind in a place so quiet that even the smallest sound felt amplified. But as I moved through the building, the feeling of unease began to build, a subtle tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. As I moved through the building, the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, slipping just beyond my line of sight. Every so often, I'd catch a faint movement in the corner of my vision, like a shadow darting away just as I turned my head. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, a trick of the low light and my tired mind. But the occurrences became more frequent, the shadows growing bolder, moving faster and closer with each pass. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, my heartbeat quickening as each shadow seemed to linger a little longer. It was as though something was just out of sight, something watching, waiting. I started moving more cautiously, my footsteps quieter, my flashlight angled carefully as I scanned each darkened corridor. The building's familiar stillness felt oppressive now, pressing in on me from all sides. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, reminding myself of the reality of the situation. But the shadows persisted, slipping into places they shouldn't be, stretching across the walls in shapes that felt almost human. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by an inexplicable dread. The flickers, the noises, and the shifting shadows had become too much to ignore. I decided to investigate, hoping to put my mind at ease. I retraced my steps, moving slowly, checking every room where I'd noticed something unusual. My flashlight cut through the darkness, casting a narrow beam that seemed almost swallowed by the shadows beyond. As I moved deeper into the building, I found a door that was slightly ajar, its hinges casting long shadows across the floor. I knew I'd closed it during my earlier rounds. My memory of it was vivid, the image clear. Swallowing the rising fear, I pushed the door open wider, peering inside to find nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the open door left an unsettling chill in its wake. Then, in a back corridor, I spotted something that stopped me in my tracks. Faint footprints in the dust on the floor. They were small, unidentifiable, but fresh enough to leave an impression. My mind raced, trying to piece together a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. The lights flickered again, casting erratic shadows over the faint prints, and I felt an intense urge to leave, to abandon my rounds, and escape the growing sense of dread. But I had a job to finish, and leaving would mean returning the next night with even more unease. I steadied myself, taking a deep breath as I prepared to continue. The sight of the faint footprints haunted me as I moved deeper into the building. Every instinct told me that I wasn't alone, that something was moving through the halls with me, just out of sight, following or perhaps waiting. My flashlight felt inadequate, barely illuminating the dense shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with each step I took. The air grew heavier as I walked, each breath feeling thick and labored. I strained my ears, hoping to catch any sign of movement. That's when I heard it again. A faint sound, like soft breathing coming from one of the nearby rooms. My pulse raced as I tried to locate the source, following the barely audible breaths through a series of empty rooms. The sound seemed to move as I moved, staying just ahead of me, leading me deeper into the dimly lit corridors. Each room was empty, silent, and still. But the sense of being watched was unshakable, a quiet, creeping dread that settled into my bones. I continued down the hallway, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, feeling as though someone or something was drawing me in, waiting for me to let my guard down. With my nerves frayed and adrenaline kicking in, I decided to head toward the security room to check the cameras, hoping that the footage would reveal something to explain the unease. As I made my way there, another flicker caught my attention. This time, closer than before, a shadow slipping along the edge of the hallway. The sensation of something lurking grew unbearable, and I quickened my pace, nearly sprinting to the security room. Inside, I closed the door, taking a moment to steady myself. I rewound the camera footage, watching each feed with a sharp focus, hoping to find some explanation for the events of the night. The footage showed empty halls, motionless corridors, and shadowed corners. But then, in several frames, brief blurs of movement appeared, distorted images that seemed to slip in and out of the frame too quickly to identify. The blurs seemed to match the locations where I'd felt the presence, where I'd seen the lights flicker and heard the sounds. My hands grew clammy as I realized that whatever it was had been moving through the building with me the entire time. As dawn approached, my dread intensified. The shadows felt closer, more tangible, almost pressing in around me as if they were closing off any escape. I pushed myself to finish the last of my rounds, determined to get through the night without letting the fear consume me. I returned to the floors I hadn't yet checked, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick, charged with an almost electric tension. The final rooms felt darker, the shadows somehow more opaque. I approached one last door, finding it slightly open, leading into a room shrouded in darkness. I hesitated, feeling an inexplicable urge to turn back, to leave the building and never return. The room was silent, the darkness impenetrable. I reached out, feeling the cold metal of the doorknob in my hand. But I didn't go in. Instead, I closed the door, sealing whatever lay inside. With a deep breath, I turned and walked away, leaving the room and its shadows behind me. By the time the first light of morning filtered through the windows, I knew I couldn't return. The events of the night had left me shaken, my sense of safety irreparably broken. I made my way to the front desk, leaving my resignation on the supervisor's desk without a second thought. The building felt different in the morning light, but the memories of the shadows and sounds lingered, vivid and unrelenting. The messages began as small, cryptic comments on my social media posts. Comments that seemed random at first, strange but harmless. A vague phrase here, an odd emoji there, things that I brushed off as typical internet noise. I'd seen my fair share of trolls before, people who got a thrill out of leaving strange remarks and moving on, and I assumed this was just another one of those cases. I would read the comments, feel a flicker of unease, but then dismiss them and continue with my day. After a few days, however, the messages became more frequent, each one a little stranger than the last. The comments would appear on various platforms, sometimes hours apart, other times within minutes of each other. They never had anything specific to say, just odd observations, phrases that felt meaningless yet left a trace of something sinister. Still, I managed to brush it off, telling myself that it was all in my head. After all, I didn't know this person. They didn't know me. It was just the internet, right? But something about it felt off, a subtle but growing unease that lingered after each new message. Then the messages began to shift, their tone becoming darker, more personal. I noticed that they referenced small details of my life, things I hadn't shared online. The way I took my coffee, a particular street I walked on, even the color of the coat I wore on certain days. My stomach dropped with each new revelation, a creeping fear settling in as I realized that someone had been watching me. The idea was absurd, of course. Who would go to such lengths? Still, the thought clung to me, refusing to let go. I started checking my locks more frequently, making sure the windows were secure, peeking out the blinds at night to see if there was anyone outside. I tried to rationalize the messages, convincing myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe this person was guessing. But deep down I felt my sense of safety slipping away. Every time I left my apartment, I'd glance over my shoulder, my footsteps quickening, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. How could someone know these things? The fear built slowly, like a shadow creeping over my life, and I found myself growing increasingly paranoid, aware of every sound, every movement around me. As the days passed, the messages became even more unsettling, each one chipping away at my composure. They were no longer vague. Instead, they referenced specifics I couldn't ignore. Comments about the brand of cereal I ate, the book I had left on my nightstand, and the time I usually returned home from work. These were things no one could have guessed, details so intimate they made my skin crawl. I considered blocking the account, reporting it even, but a part of me hesitated. The messages felt too personal, too intentional. Blocking them might not solve anything. It would only make me lose track of what they were saying. I needed to know what they knew, to understand just how much of my life had been exposed. Each new message added another layer to my dread, an inescapable realization that I was being watched. Even in my own apartment, my safe space, I felt vulnerable, hyper-aware of my surroundings, noticing every sound, every small detail I'd previously ignored. The once familiar walls felt like they were closing in, my sanctuary turning into a cage. One morning, just as I was leaving for work, I spotted something on my sofa. At first, I thought I'd left a piece of paper there by accident, but as I got closer, my stomach twisted. It was a note, a small slip of paper with a single, chilling message scrawled across it. I don't remember the exact words, but the meaning was clear. Someone had been here, inside my home, watching me. I could almost feel their presence, lingering in the air as though they had only just left. My hands shook as I reached for the note, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it. I turned toward the front door, instinctively checking the lock, and that's when I noticed it. It was only on the latch. I remembered locking it carefully the night before, going through my usual routine of double-checking everything before bed. But now, it was clear that someone had been inside, moving through my space without a trace. The realization left me frozen, a wave of terror crashing over me as I tried to process what had happened. Whoever was behind the messages wasn't just a random person online. They were here, in my home, slipping in and out of my life with ease. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a dark, bottomless pit, the weight of my fear pressing down on me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just a game. I was in real danger, and something had to change. After finding the note, my apartment no longer felt like my own. Every corner seemed to hold a lingering threat, shadows that had once been familiar now feeling like hiding places. I started avoiding being home whenever possible, finding excuses to stay out, work, errands, anything that would keep me away. But every time I returned, the sense of unease weighed on me, pressing in like an invisible force. I'd enter slowly, checking each room, feeling the irrational but unshakable suspicion that someone was still there, watching from the darkness. I grew jumpy, hyper-aware of the smallest sounds, the creak of the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant voices from the street below. Each noise felt charged, filled with an intent I couldn't quite name. My nights became restless, my sleep broken by thoughts of someone lurking just beyond my sight. Each creak in the night brought with it a new wave of fear, and I found myself lying in bed, gripping the blankets and staring at the door, dreading the possibility that I might not be alone. I knew I couldn't live like this much longer. Something had to give. After several nights of feeling trapped in my own apartment, I decided to reach out to the police. I showed them the messages, explained the intrusions, the note I'd found on my sofa. They listened politely, their expressions carefully neutral as they noted my concerns. But after a brief investigation, they told me what I already feared. They couldn't find any evidence of a break-in, no signs that anyone had forced their way inside. Their words left me feeling helpless. Without proof, there was little they could do, and their lack of action felt like a dismissal, as if my fear was unwarranted, a misunderstanding. I tried to confide in a close friend, hoping for reassurance, but they only echoed what the police had said, suggesting I might be overthinking things, letting my imagination run wild. With no one to truly understand what I was going through, I felt even more isolated, my fear intensifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone knew every detail of my life, slipping in and out of my space with a cold, calculated intent. I was living in a nightmare no one else could see, and there was no one to pull me out of it. After weeks of dread, I finally decided to leave, convinced that distance was the only way to escape whoever was haunting my life. I began researching apartments in other cities, places far from my current life, places where I could start over. The thought of moving, of leaving everything behind, was daunting, but my fear had grown beyond reason. I couldn't stay here, not with the constant sense of danger hanging over me. I started packing my belongings, working methodically, trying to focus on the task at hand instead of the fear gnawing at the back of my mind. But as I packed, I noticed small things that felt off. Items slightly out of place, drawers open just a crack, things I didn't remember moving. It was as if someone had been inside, subtly disturbing my space, leaving signs only I would notice. Each night felt like a countdown to my escape, the fear intensifying as my departure grew closer. I double-checked every lock, every window, each creak of the floorboards making my pulse quicken. The sense of being watched, of being surrounded by an unseen presence, had reached a fever pitch, and I counted the days until I could leave it all behind. I moved into this building for its quiet atmosphere. After long workdays, I treasured coming home to a place that felt almost untouched by the city's chaos. The neighbors were polite but kept to themselves, a trait I found oddly comforting. Among them was a man who lived just down the hall. He was hard to miss, a tall figure, usually wrapped in oversized coats, with an expression that was always somewhat distant, like he was preoccupied with something the rest of us couldn't see. He barely acknowledged anyone, and our interactions were limited to the occasional nod in the hallway. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some people simply preferred their solitude. But over time, small changes in his behavior began to creep into my notice, though I tried to brush them off. One evening, as I returned from work, I passed him in the hallway. He was leaning against the wall, muttering softly to himself. His eyes didn't meet mine, and the words were unintelligible, an odd string of sounds that made no sense. I told myself it was just one of those things. Everyone has off days. But the sight of him standing there, lips moving in some private conversation, left a slight tension in my chest. I hurried past, dismissing it as a one-time oddity, though the image clung to me as I settled in for the evening. Over the next few weeks, I started to see him more frequently, though always in strange circumstances. It was as though he became a fixture of the night, appearing only after the rest of the building had gone silent. I'd pass by the window near the stairwell late at night and see him standing just outside, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Sometimes he'd stand motionless, his face cast in the dim glow of the streetlight, and other times he'd shift, his head tilting, as if he were listening to something just out of earshot. I found myself going out of my way to avoid those late-night encounters, though curiosity got the best of me at times. I'd glance out my window, searching for his figure, wondering what he was seeing or hearing that held him there, night after night. He looked so lost, a shadow among shadows, his frame tense and his posture unnaturally stiff. Each time I saw him, an unsettling feeling crept up my spine. He wasn't doing anything outwardly alarming, but there was something unnatural about his presence, like he was part of some other world that had started to seep into ours. Despite my attempts to rationalize it, stress, insomnia, maybe a personal struggle, my mind wouldn't fully accept these excuses. The sight of him became a mark of unease, a subtle disruption in the peace I'd come to expect here. One night, I was jolted awake by a strange sound from the hallway. It was the heavy, uneven thud of footsteps, pacing back and forth just beyond my door. At first, I stayed in bed, hoping it would stop, but the noise persisted, each step more frantic than the last. Heart pounding, I slid out of bed and moved cautiously to the peephole, curious but hesitant to see what was happening outside. Through the narrow lens, I saw him, my neighbor, pacing in front of his own door with a wild intensity. His arms waved erratically, his fingers curling and uncurling as he spoke to no one in particular. I couldn't make out his words, but his voice rose and fell in a feverish, almost angry rhythm. His gaze darted around the hallway, his eyes wide and unfocused, as if he were arguing with something I couldn't see. The scene left me rooted in place, a knot of tension settling in my stomach. He looked unhinged, so far removed from the quiet man I'd seen before. I watched as he continued to pace, his movements growing more animated, his expression twisting between frustration and fear. There was a desperation to him that made my skin crawl. I stayed by the peephole until he eventually retreated back into his apartment, slamming the door behind him. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was experiencing was something profoundly disturbing, something that existed just beyond my understanding. In the days that followed, his behavior only intensified. Late at night, I'd hear him shouting, his voice muffled but filled with a kind of rage that was hard to ignore. The walls seemed to tremble with his anger, as though he was fighting a battle within those four walls. Once, I ventured into the hallway and pressed my ear against his door, hoping to catch some hint of what he was going through. But his words were still fragmented, a jumble of sounds that carried no meaning to me, only a raw intensity that set my nerves on edge. Other neighbors began to notice, their whispers filling the building. I caught snippets of their conversations, hushed murmurs speculating about his mental state. Some suggested he was unwell, while others shrugged it off, dismissing him as an eccentric. But none of their casual comments matched the dread that had begun to settle over me. I couldn't shake the sense that his actions were driven by something more than stress or a troubled mind. There was a darkness in his eyes, an intensity that seemed beyond ordinary comprehension. It felt as though the walls of his apartment had absorbed his distress, radiating an invisible tension that made even the air around his door feel oppressive. I started avoiding that side of the hallway, unwilling to confront whatever it was that had taken hold of him. But even in the safety of my own apartment, I couldn't escape the awareness of him, just on the other side of the wall, caught in some private nightmare that was beginning to spill over into my world. It was a Thursday evening when I experienced the most unnerving interaction yet. I had just finished dinner, lost in the rhythm of my evening routine, when there was a knock at my door. The sound was soft but persistent, each tap echoing in the silence of my apartment. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a sense of dread prickled at the base of my neck as I made my way to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw him, my neighbor, standing just outside, his face obscured in the shadows of the hallway. He looked different, somehow more gaunt, his eyes vacant yet focused in my direction. With a deep breath, I cracked the door open, keeping the chain latched as a precaution. He didn't speak at first, He just stared, his gaze steady and unblinking, as if waiting for something I couldn't comprehend. After what felt like an eternity, he mumbled something, his voice low and unintelligible. The words were slurred, broken, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. I asked him to repeat himself, but he just continued to stare, his lips barely moving. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. Then, without any warning, he turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate, fading down the hallway. I closed the door, a chill settling over me. The brief interaction had left me shaken, and I couldn't help but feel that he was reaching out in some way, trying to communicate something that went beyond words. But whatever message he was trying to convey, it was lost in the eerie quiet that now seemed to settle over the building like a fog. The next day, I found myself listening for any sign of him, but his apartment was silent. No pacing footsteps, no muffled shouting, just an unsettling stillness that pressed against the walls. At first, I thought he was simply out, maybe at work or visiting someone. But as days passed, the silence remained, each night devoid of the sounds that had become disturbingly familiar. I asked a few neighbors if they'd seen him, but no one seemed to know anything. Some shrugged, mentioning they hadn't noticed him for a while others seemed relieved by his absence. The hallway outside his door took on a different atmosphere, the air thicker, heavier, as if some presence lingered just beyond my reach. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him, if he'd left of his own accord, or if something had taken him, some invisible force that had been lurking all along. In a strange way, I missed the sounds, as unsettling as they had been. The silence felt unnatural, hollow, a void where he had once been. My curiosity turned to an uneasy compulsion, and I found myself drawn to his door, hesitating outside, half expecting to hear his voice on the other side. But there was only the cold quiet, a stillness that seemed to stretch into an endless emptiness. Over the following weeks, the building returned to its usual rhythm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His apartment remained untouched, the door closed and locked as if frozen in time. The neighbors who once whispered about him moved on, their lives continuing without pause. Yet every time I passed his door, a chill washed over me, as if some remnant of him lingered, a shadow that refused to fade. I began to avoid his door altogether, thus taking longer routes through the building to bypass the hallway where he had once paced and shouted. But the sense of something left unfinished gnawed at me, a question with no answer, a mystery that seemed to exist just out of reach. I thought about asking the building manager, but part of me didn't want to know, didn't want to disturb whatever strange peace had settled in his absence. Yet every night, I felt the same creeping dread whenever I passed his door. It was as though he was still there, just beyond the threshold, a silent presence that watched and waited, held in the grip of whatever had overtaken him. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I was not alone in the hallway, that something had changed, some invisible line crossed that could never be undone. Time went on, and the building resumed its quiet, but for me, the feeling never left. His door remained closed, a silent reminder of the man who had once haunted its threshold. Occasionally, I'd catch myself lingering outside his apartment, drawn by an unshakable sense that something was waiting on the other side. The other residents seemed oblivious, indifferent to the vacancy, but for me, the mystery hung heavy, a weight I couldn't shed.